Dear bright minds, this is the first Alum Chat in 2022, and it's a very, very special one. So Fulbright Austria alums join us today, and we have two of them here today. Katherine Baber, our first Fulbright-Botstiber visiting professor of Austrian-American Studies, is here today. And Casey Hayes, our most recent Fulbright-Botstiber visiting professor of Austrian-American Studies, is here as well. And both will interview each other to discuss musical culture in Austria, the LGBTQI+ movement, Paolo Montes, Leonard Bernstein, Viennese cabaret culture, and the Weimar-era. So we are really looking forward to your contributions. We are also so grateful for the excellent partnerships we have and the excellent partners. And today, this event is co-organized by the Botstiber Institute of Austrian-American Studies. BIAAS also funds the Fulbright-Botstiber visiting professor of Austrian-American Studies, and we are grateful for that. And therefore, it's my honor and pleasure to host this event together with Kevin McNamara, the new managing director of BIAAS. So, dear Kevin, the stage is yours.
Good evening. My name is Kevin McNamara. I am the new managing director of the Botstiber Institute, which is located in suburban Philadelphia, the heart of Viennese culture in America. I'm kidding. And I'm just delighted to meet the Botstiber fellows through the Fulbright program. The Institute has been around for more than a dozen years. We've awarded grants totaling more than $3 million in that time. And we're celebrating the 10th anniversary of the Botstiber program through Fulbright Austria. And we're proud of that too. I would just ask people to tell your friends, your colleagues, your family members, tell them all about the Botstiber Institute and the research grants and the fellowships that we offer. We are always looking to expand our reach and our influence. And I'm delighted to be here and to meet these two very fine fellows. I hand it back to you, Hermann.
Thank you, Kevin. By the way, our joint award is now open for applications. So if you're interested in submitting your application, it's now on the web. So with this, I now have the pleasure to introduce our two alums. Katherine Baber. Katherine earned her bachelor's of music and her PhD in musicology from the Jacobs School of Music at Indiana University. So she is, she was the associate professor of music and history at the University of Redlands, and she currently serves as the Alice Mosley Salzburg Director and as Associate Dean of the College of Arts and Science. She also serves on the editorial board of the Journal of Austrian-American History. So a lot on your plate, Katherine. Congratulations for that. She also was our the first Fulbright-Botstiber visiting professor of Austrian-American Studies at the University of Vienna and the University of Music and Performing Arts. So if you want to know more about how the collaboration started and what the first impact on our collaboration was, you can ask her. Yeah? I also would like now to introduce Casey Hayes. Casey earned his Bachelor and Master of Music in Music Education from Butler University in Indiana, and his PhD in Music Education from Steinhardt School of Education in New York University, actually in 2009, if I'm right. He currently serves as professor of music in the music department, chair, and that at Franklin College in Indiana as well. His book, and by the way, I just bought it, so that's a shout out. Yeah, his book on the life of Willy Rosen was just published by Amsterdam Press in the beginning of the year. So thank you for this wonderful contribution. In 2021, Casey was selected as Fulbright-Botstiber visiting professor Austrian-American studies, and you joined Austria in a very specific time during a pandemic, and you worked at the University of Music and Performing Arts here in Vienna. So thank you both for joining us today and to use this time to, discuss a bit about your experience as well as about your research. We are really looking forward to hear from you. So with this, the stage is yours.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for the introduction. So Casey, if circumstances were different, we'd probably be sitting down at a cafe to have a conversation like this one. I'm curious to know if we were able to do that, what would your order be?
Oh, the one thing I loved about Vienna is that there's so many different varieties of coffee. So I don't like making choices like that. So the first thing I do is go with what I know, and I always order a cappuccino. And what about you?
Usually just a double shot of espresso with some cream, the grosse braune. Yeah.
The grosse braune. Yeah. I always thought it would be bigger because it's grosse. Americans have a tendency to, coffee, big, and it's just not very big. So
tall but mighty.
Tall but mighty. And did you find that your taste changed in coffees once you got over there?
Not so much, really. It just became easier to get what I really wanted, which was just a fair amount of espresso to wake me up. Yeah, versus that wasn't then as common in the United States. I think actually what's happened, what I've observed, because it's been quite a while now since that fellowship, I think coffee culture in the US has kind of migrated towards the sort of diversity of options that we've always had in Vienna and in Austria. So,
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Being back in the States now, one of the things I miss is that coffee culture, and I'm right back to just drinking bad coffee. You miss that because there is still, even though there's Starbucks there's no substitute for Cafe Sparrow or Cafe Himmel or Landsmann or any number of the fabulous places that are there.
For sure.
But I always wondered, because Katie, you're growing up, you're from the Midwest, and what made you becoming interested in Austria? You live in Salzburg, and what was it that really moved you about Austria for you to pick up your entire life and go there?
Yeah, it's a good question. How does somebody born in Illinois and educated in Indiana wind up here? But because I had a conservatory training, first on clarinet and then moving into musicology, I had always been steeped in the music and the history of this place. As a clarinet player, particularly for Mozart, it's our most famous concerto. I still have much of it memorized. All of that had always been sort of a part of my life and my education. But I had never actually studied here because that just sort of wasn't done in conservatory training. Why, if you were apprenticed to this person, why would you go somewhere else for a year or semester? And then taking up an American dissertation topic on Leonard Bernstein, there was never a reason for me to go abroad to study then. All my resources were in Washington, DC and New York City. And that's often the point at which people sort of join Fulbright, is when they need to go do some research somewhere as a post-grad, or,
Sure.
To sort of have some time abroad after they graduate. And that just wasn't when I came into contact with it. But because I'd been an Americanist by training, all of a sudden I was exportable within the Fulbright program once I became a faculty member. So it was really nice to get to talk to Austria and, quite frankly, to a really international student group. When I was here, the people who study at the MDW, at the Conservatory of Performing Arts in Vienna, and also at the musicology department, the University of Vienna, a fair number of them are Austrian, but a lot of them are not. It's a really international culture among the students, and I found that I really liked seeing that diversity and hearing that diversity of perspectives in the classroom. Obviously, my research became more and more entangled in Vienna and in the resources there, also in Salzburg, the archives at the Salzburg Festival. So I just kept sort of coming back but since 2013. And so when the opportunity to move and to direct my own university study abroad program came up, it was just, by then it was a no-brainer. I'd been spending so much time here it had become kind of a part of my life anyway. It was just kind of time to take the next step. Yeah.
Yes, I'm entirely jealous, by the way.
Not the only one. I have a lot of colleagues in my home institution too. How do I get that job? What? You know?
Yeah. Oh no, I'm sure there's a lot of people watching. A lot of people watching you.
Yeah. Yeah. But I always think of it was probably, you know, one of the best possible outcomes for a Fulbright, honestly.
Sure.
So I'm curious about, you know, you had an initial experience in Vienna that was very strongly shaped by the pandemic, but obviously you formed sort of a close connection with the place socially. But I'm also curious about the research-wise, because your topic, Paulo Montes, was, despite being a musicologist, not a figure I'd heard of. And so I'm curious what you have sort of learned from his life. So for people who haven't read any of your research yet, he was a Weimar-era cabaret performer. He was also a gay man. And so he fled to Vienna during the rise of the National Socialists, and subsequent to that, though, unfortunately, died in a concentration camp. So I wonder what you've learned by studying him about how he uses music and performance to create sort of an open space for himself, for his individual identity, but also within a larger cultural conversation. I think it's one thing we do have in common is that we do work with identity a lot in our research. Bernstein, of course, is an American conductor who spent a ton of time in Austria, was also a gay man, was also a Jewish artist very prominently. That's sort of the end of the similarities between the two, but there is something I think to be learned from your work with Montes about how we create spaces to express identities that may not always be at the center of a given culture.
I think it's hard, particularly we're talking, you know, it's hard for people to historically put themselves back in a paradigm of LGBTQI+ in 1920s Berlin. So, you know, we have to kind of remember that this was a time period where the authorities and the police had much bigger problems on their hands than what was happening with people's sexual lives. With the economy crashing, and it kind of allowed this community to come forward. But the community was very oftentimes shaped by the spaces they performed in. And particularly for Montes, he was the most prominent gay performer. Now we have, you know, there's always questions about Marlene Dietrich and where she falls on the sexual spectrum as far as, you know, who's the most prominent. But Montes was one that was, I use the word allowed, and I'll explain it in a bit, to be himself on stage, frequently wearing women's pumps while wearing a tux, and had an overly effeminate mannerism and vocal singing style. His chanteuse style was very luxurious. It was very feminine. Whereas other performers that maybe I had identified somewhere on the LGBT spectrum would perform as maybe female impersonators, or Montes was his own being. And so much so that he was even accepted by the National Socialists and interviewed in the Deutsche Beobachter, Cologne's version of the Nazi newspaper, where it's a prominent interview of Paulo Montes, where he is unabashedly himself and still was able to fly under the radar to a degree. Until finally it just simply became so obvious that the powers, particularly Goebbels, had to do something about it. But we learn more so about how Vienna becomes that destination for the LGBTQI+ and the performing community, if for nothing else other than the fact that it had an established cabaret culture and it spoke German.
Yeah.
So people always go, well, why would they do that? Why would they go to some place like Vienna that's so close and threatened? And It's really about, our performances through our speech, it's through our singing. Our audience needs to understand German. And O Montes was one of those that ends up in Vienna with several dozen other very famous cabaret performers. So, you could say, what do we glean? They made poor choices, but we can never put ourselves in their place. They were artists and they were musicians and performers. So they went to where their audience was. I think like any performer would, until they had no other choice in 38.
Yeah. And I think probably, I don't know if you've encountered this a little bit, but still sort of the mythos of Vienna as just an inherently cosmopolitan place might have seemed like it was safe enough or could be welcoming. I think perhaps political allies, like there was still like a really strong socialist movement in Vienna at the time.
Right, and I think that there were enough distractions for the LGBT community to go to Vienna, knowing the anti-Semitism and knowing the role that the communists played within the city, that maybe they could fly under the radar. It was funny that they would gravitate into the predominantly Jewish areas of the city. To try to kind of, again, fly under that proverbial radar. But, it was, Vienna was certainly no Berlin in the 1930s. And it was still that as cosmopolitan as it would think it were. I think most Berliners would still look at Vienna in 1935 as a large backwater, and had very different views of Vienna.
Yeah, fair enough. Wouldn't say it out loud in Vienna, where I just returned.
Absolutely not. Well, I am a huge fan of Vienna. That's where I want to be at this moment. Unfortunately, I am here, which I love, by the way. But thank you. So since we leave O Montes in the hands of the National Socialists, and we know that machine was infamous for reappropriation of composers and their music, like Wagner and Liszt, and still having to find a place for them within Western musical traditions. You wrote that American musicians had to be negotiators. It's clever. Acknowledging the classical traditions of Europe while advancing an American musical culture that could speak to modernity. How was Bernstein affected by Austria's national identity with respect to music, do you think? How was he able to craft, so to speak, a space and a place for himself and for the music of the United States? I know a lot of things wrapped up in.
No, but it's interesting because they're sort of separated by this, this rupture that we perceive in the Second World War, but they're both people who are traveling to Vienna to continue their careers on either side of this sort of huge this huge trauma, and also this huge period in which people are claiming cultural figures and then reclaiming them and then taking them back again. So it does there are some resonances. He was somebody who came to Vienna to an existing tradition, and he was very well aware of that. It was his own tradition in the United States. He was doing extremely well for himself as an up-and-coming conductor, had sort of made a big splash. And then the first time he's in Austria in the wake of, very close to the wake of World War II, he is in some ways kind of coming to the source that many would still sort of perceive Central Europe and places like Vienna to be sort of a source or wellspring for classical music, and he kind of knows that. But he's also coming to a place that's been torn apart and where very many Jewish people have been murdered, and he's also clearly well aware of that as well. And it's for him personally, it's a tension between those things. And so his way of sort of navigating in this space is, I think, for him, very strongly conditioned by those two things. He is at first perceived as wholly American. In fact, too American in some ways. His first concert in Vienna, the Mozart that he played, he's very fond of playing Mozart, doing a concerto from the keyboard, conducting from the keyboard. And then, you know, conducting a few other pieces. Usually one of them is going to be American. It was sort of his shtick, was like, okay, I can do the European classical stuff. I can also perform in this space. I can do the Mozart at the keyboard. And hey, look, also I can introduce you to these American figures that I think are also worth considering alongside these existing parts of the tradition. And so he comes and he does that. And the audience in Vienna the first time around in the late 40s is very much like, this is, the Mozart's too romantic. What are you doing? This is not what we expect. But boy, he's an exciting young conductor. And there is in fact actually also kind of a way in which he's towing a line too as a conductor. He's often perceived as being too theatrical. And I think sometimes your descriptions of Amantis sound a little bit like some of the criticism that gets aimed at him is like, there's a point at which it's almost too much. And he has to say just this side of what's acceptable. And I have a colleague who's doing some very interesting work on the ways in which that can be read as homophobic, a lot of that criticism. He was closeted much of his life, but then later on in life, it was an open secret and then also part of his public life. And so in his conducting, he's kind of always towing that line. And I think particularly when he's in Europe, the first few times he's a little over the line for a lot of people, but it gets read as like, it's an American enthusiasm. So, you know,
yeah,
that's what he is. And so he has to keep sort of working his way in. He gets told in 1958 by the Salzburg Festival, like, no, you just can't play Mozart. That shtick was not acceptable. Although some of that I think has to do with the way Salzburg very carefully manages their Mozart content at the Salzburg Festival. There's the Mozart matinees, and there's the sacred music series, and now the Overture Spirituelle. And Mozart gets framed very carefully within those selections. So I think it was just not a part of their program, and so they didn't want it. But he does eventually get to this point where he's able to, by dint of just being a really moving conductor who manages to persuade audiences, he conducts an entire Verdi opera from memory and just gets this wonderful reception at the Staatsoper. The public sort of comes to love him for just the sheer showmanship and the sheer sort of artistry of what he does. He also is really dedicated to making sure each composer and their music sounds like that composer. And so he does, I think, also to the musical institutions in Vienna, to the Vienna Philharmonic, to the Staatsoper, proves that I can make your Verdi sound like really good Verdi. And I can make your Beethoven sound like really good Beethoven if you will just come with me on this. And then eventually gets to a place in the 1960s where he's persuading Austrian orchestras to re-accept Austrian figures like Mahler into their repertoire. And he's doing this based on this thing he's always had to do as the outsider, negotiating his way within a tradition and within audiences that claim that tradition as their own.
I find it interesting because several, whether it was the tribute to JFK's death or to Robert's death, that he chooses to conduct Mahler, the Mahler Resurrection for JFK, and then Symphony No. 5 for Robert. That love affair of Mahler as the Austrian figure being so wildly represented by an American conductor at some of our key historic moments. I think it's quite telling how he was taken by it.
Yeah, and again, it has a little bit to do with like aspects of personal identity. That he feels drawn to Mahler because Mahler's another Jewish figure. And he's another figure who's a conductor and a composer, like Bernstein was. He's another figure who traveled back and forth between the US and Europe. And so there's just a very personal connection for him, but it's also a one of lineage. And that's what also sort of allowed him to make a space, was like he'd been a protege of Bruno Walter. He'd been sort of connected to these figures that were already connected to the Vienna Philharmonic, to the tradition of the performance of Mahler in Europe. And so also to Mitropoulos, to other people who sort of ushered him into this tradition and made him sort of a figure who had a lineage within it in a way that he wouldn't have had otherwise as an American. So sure. he gets accepted in Austria eventually as what one of the critics calls a verkappte Vienna, like that he's a Viennese in disguise. And and that's sort of his way in. And he manages to bring along a few other figures with him, people like Mahler, composers like his friend Samuel Barber, his contemporary, I would say.
Cool.
Part of a similar circle of American composers. You know, he manages to bring along American figures with him for that journey. So, like, speaking of traveling, which has been sort of the other theme here, people who keep migrating from place to place. So Omontis migrates with German cabaret to Vienna and within the German language. What can we understand from that genre about how music migrates? Because it's famously omnivorous, right?
It
Draws on all these different traditions.
I think how cabaret migrates is very different from like how mainstream, like how certainly how like Bernstein would bring Copland to Vienna, for example. Cabaret didn't quite work that way because cabaret acts and cabaret songs were so closely identified with an individual. For example, like Omontis's songs would not be sung necessarily by other cabaret artists. They would be known to be Omontis songs that he would have recorded on Odeon. So when you look at cabaret, even Jewish cabaret, which was so prominent, and one of the only cabaret, it's very ironic that Jewish / communists joined forces after the Anschluss in Vienna to keep the only cabaret in the city going. And the Nazis kind of conveniently looked the other way as they were able to do that. But you had other people like Erika Mann and Arthur, Oscar Teller and Jimmy Berg, who were huge, prominent cabaret performers during this time that would leave and follow the other cabaret performers to New York, or generally follow many Viennese intellectuals, musicians, performers to New York. So we're able to see that a culture, it's like a coffee culture, a cabaret culture, which really wasn't in existence in that form in New York City in the 1930s and 40s, follows these performers into New York and becomes this safe haven for Austrian Jews or Austrian cabaret performers to develop enclaves like on the Upper East Side, or in Oscar Teller's case, the Upper West Side, and be able to almost recreate what they had in places like Cafe Vienna or Die Arche, which was a cabaret by Oscar Teller. Except it wasn't meant to be sustained. And I think that's kind of the lesson that we learn from where we can see Copland and Barber going to Europe and their music largely influencing other people and living on today. The cabaret performers that end up migrating to in New York City eventually find that being Austrian, speaking German, or even being Jewish is an inconvenience. And being identified by an American populace as these people are German speaking, it starts becoming uncomfortable to keep those communities together. And we start seeing a gradual disintegration of cabaret culture, so that by 1954, the people that have largely migrated from Vienna to New York to create this Austrian cabaret culture are gone. They've moved either to the West Coast, they've gone to Palestine, they've left cabaret altogether. They become, like Jimmy Berg, the voice of Radio Free Europe. They've become very, very entrenched in a completely different genre than Viennese cabaret. Yet we learn through research, particularly the research of Oscar Teller and his archives at Literaturhaus Wien, that you can see that although he leaves cabaret, it never leaves him. And he's able to maintain the connections of those performers up until he dies in the 1980s. So even though we see that migratory music and even that migratory community die away, there are still a few people that are able to keep the conversation going.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, just a little bit crazy. But we we can look, one of the things that we see that I think when we see anyone migrate out of Vienna during this time period, particularly during the Anschluss and stuff, is that they're looking for just simply a place that is safe to be, right? Even though when it comes to the LGBTQ community, when the National Socialists enter Austria, they're really quite surprised to find out that the Austrian laws are stricter than their own. And so they go, oh, okay, well, we'll just leave those in place. So Austria seemed to be a challenging place, of expectations and rules with respect to LGBT community, and even with music, as you say, with Bernstein and Mozart. So we say, what is allowed? Who's allowed to perform what? Who has the authority? Would you say this is tied to a larger Austrian identity? And is Austria somehow different in this regard from like the US or even Germany?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And when you look at it from, the bird's eye view of sort of very broad generalizations about cultures, like oftentimes people sort of peg Austrians being, well, they're a fan of rules. They follow rules.
Yes, they do.
I think a lot of our students, particularly if they're from the East Coast, are shocked at how many people actually wait at crosswalks while they're here, because you're meant to. But then there's always going to be something as a counterpoint. I mean, the protests I'm still seeing every weekend against the vaccine mandate would speak very powerfully to the fact that there's always nuance, and there's always got to be a counterexample to whatever one tends to see as a generalization or a trend, or sometimes just merely it's just a stereotype. But I will say that if you're looking at sort of the organizations that present classical music in Austria, even when compared to Germany, which shares a language and shares a lot of these cultural figures, they have to they have shared custody of Beethoven. These kinds of issues, like, they are very closely tied together, but are still very, very different. Even if you just look at the Berlin Philharmonic and the Vienna Philharmonic, and how many sort of international members they have, when they had their first female members, the kinds of conductors that they have selected. The Berlin Philharmonic, of course, they do have a music director. In each case, they have one sort of conductor who does most of their concerts, versus Vienna's always rotated conductors through. But even then, you can kind of see these sort of very different approaches to how we continue to present the classical tradition. And so in Austria, it is places and organizations like the Musikverein, like the Staatsoper, like the Vienna Philharmonic, who are very clear, actually, in their like founding documents and principles about these organizations, that we are here to preserve and to promote a particular kind of tradition, whether that's continuing to perform works by Mozart or sponsoring rehearsals of a new work by Brahms. They still remain sort of very tied to that tradition in a way that Berlin Philharmonic doesn't necessarily. Neither necessarily does the New York Philharmonic, even though those are things that are like expected on a concert season. That kind of institutional commitment to, this is our domain and our thing that we are preserving and promoting, isn't necessarily as explicit as it is with some of the Viennese organizations. That said, I think they all are organizations that share a concern for how we move forward. And that's where I think sort of the generalization that, like, well, Austrian culture hews a little bit more strictly to these traditions. We're still doing things like the New Year's concert. We're still having opera balls. We're still doing all of these very, very traditional things in Viennese classical music. Still, just like orchestras in the United States, just like orchestras in Germany, concerned about, well, where do we go forward from here? Yeah. So I've had the pleasure to host some of the members of the Vienna Philharmonic's Academy of their young artists, who they take in each year. It's a recent initiative that they've started doing, making sure that they're bringing new people and explicitly international students into this tradition, which is something that I think is a really interesting initiative, that it doesn't have to just be the Viennese heritage. It can be the Viennese way of performing. And that's in fact part of what the Academy does, is teaches young musicians how to perform in the style of this particular orchestra. But they're opening it up to a fully international group. So
Nice.
yeah, it's a really interesting move. And I think it's one of the examples. It's like, okay, sure, it's preserving a tradition. I can't think of another orchestra where it's quite so clear that you have to learn to do it this orchestra's way. And it's special ways of performing this music, though probationary periods and things like that are a part of a lot of orchestras, the way that they are. But just the Vienna Philharmonic is an unusually rigorous one that they've had. You have your probationary period, you do your work at the Staatsoper, and then you eventually get, promoted to being a full member of the Philharmonic. Those things, yeah.
That doesn't shock anyone, does it?
No.
I mean,
but they're making it clear that it's like, but if you want to join us, right, you're welcome.
Yeah.
So I think that's a, provided that you are also like an incredible young musician, but that's just sort of the case everywhere. So I think that's, there's a lot of authority embedded in organizations like that. The fact that they receive funding also from the government, there's a lot of authority that, that city council essentially has over these things. Anybody who is a stakeholder, funding wise, has some say in this. So yeah, but it's not all just the rules and the traditions and the preservational instinct. It's also looking forward to a next generation.
Sure.
What they have to offer, and it's also explicitly an international generation. Yeah. So I'm curious, given that you joined Vienna at a time when international exchange was especially difficult.
Yeah.
During the pandemic, we had lots of rules to follow during the pandemic as well. I'm curious what your experience was like as one of the most recent Fulbright-Botstiber grantees.
It was remarkable, life-changing. I think you want, those are the key things that you really want to take away from anything. And it was challenging. I mean, we were there for months and it was locked down. Research had to be limited to individuals that you would meet. We would meet out usually at Belvedere, out on a park bench. And we would talk with individuals. You didn't have access to archives or to museums or anything to get your research. So we had to be very creative in how you were able to glean your information. And then of course there was the whole issue of making contacts with them. You're here in a foreign country and you just have to get online and find out who runs this, find an email, hope they're checking. And that was tricky. But one of the things I am convinced probably would not have happened were it not for the pandemic is how close our cohort of Fulbrighters got. Yeah. Because we relied so heavily on each other. We couldn't meet Viennese. We couldn't meet our cohorts in our universities. We couldn't even really go in to our schools. Most of us taught our classes virtually from our apartments. We never met our students. Everything was very hands-off. So the only people we really knew until the country opened up on like May 19th were each other. So to this day, we are all very, very much part of each other's lives, we like to think. And I don't know if that necessarily would have happened if a global pandemic didn't force us all together. We probably would have come together at that first initial Fulbright meeting where we all introduced ourselves, and then we probably would have all went our separate ways and done our research and worked with our cohorts, and that wasn't the case. But I wouldn't change it. I wouldn't change it for worlds, because coming out of it, you develop, because for months it's you in the city. Yeah. I grew to love Vienna like nowhere else on earth. Yeah. And my friends in Vienna, whether they were American or they were Viennese, have changed my life forever. And you can't, there's no more powerful testament than you can give to that. So I kind of envy people who are coming into their Fulbright experience, not in a global pandemic, or at least on the downward slide of it. Just because the perspective that I have, I think, is very unique, and my cohorts, I know, say the same. Yeah. And I'm sure yours was completely different than mine, but being the first, you have to tell us how different was mine.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of what you say about sort of where your attention is and where your orientation is very different when you're not locked down. Mine was also a little different because I had two different institutions that I was a member of. So being both at the University of Vienna and at the Performing Arts University, I was sort of shuttling back and forth across town. They're like opposite sides of the ring. But I did sort of make acquaintances and then longer term bonds out of that of course wouldn't have happened without Fulbright. Although I will say that we do sometimes within the cohort, you still form attachments. I do have a good friend who she was also jointly appointed, so she was splitting her time between Budapest and Vienna. So she and I are still in touch because we kept coming back to do research, and so we would always swap apartments in the two cities. And so she and I still work. I Skype her into my classes for my students here when I need sort of a specialist on the Hungarian part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So that's really great. I wouldn't have met Christina if she hadn't been a part of my cohort that year with Fulbright. But yeah, it was the much more standard. I came to know Austrian individuals and institutions fairly well, maintained a connection to the archivist for the Vienna Philharmonic. Because fun story, like I actually also had a closed archive because my Fulbright semester began right after they had completed their sort of the Vienna Philharmonic's kind of massive reckoning with the period of the Third Reich and the 1930s and 40s in their archive, and they had published that and then shut the archive for a few months, and were referring questions to the historians who'd done the work. And I now know some of those historians and now know the archivist, but at the time it was extraordinarily frustrating. I think probably in a similar way to you, that it's like, if I could just get in the building.
Yeah, please, anything, let us in.
Thankfully she let me in later. And we've stayed in touch, and I wouldn't have had the connection to the Philharmonics Academy if I hadn't been having coffee with her in the midst of the pandemic, out of doors in Vienna. And I had said, if anybody's having trouble finding housing in Salzburg for the festival, let me know, because I have this great big building that's not being used by American students. And I know that it's hard because the artists tend to stay places of Salzburgers who have left during the festival. And of course, nobody was leaving because pandemic. So it's like, if you know anyone's having a hard time, just let me know. And soon enough, I got a call from the person who directs the academy, and she's like, actually, I have a bunch of students that would really love a place. So it's led to these, these 2 summers that I've had, surrounded by the musicians who are performing in the festival, and very sort of deeply connected to Salzburg, actually, in a way, instead of Vienna that I wasn't. I wouldn't have had that without the pandemic, for one, having to stay here during that period of time. I think a lot of Salzburgers kind of reconnected with the festival since it was mostly for us in 2020. But I also definitely wouldn't have been here in the first place if it hadn't been for Fulbright-Botstiber setting up those connections as well, so that they could be deepened by circumstance. And yeah.
I always feel like one of the luckiest people in the world.
Yeah. Definitely.
I mean, you cannot replace the experiences that we've had and the transformative power of it.
Absolutely not. Yeah. I understand that we're supposed to possibly have questions from anyone who's joined us.
Yes, Mitch will bring them in now.
Hey, Catherine. Hey, Casey. Thank you so much for the wonderful conversation. I have 3 questions. We'll start by continuing the conversation, and then there's a question also about grants. But to start and continue the conversation, I think first for Casey, the question came about artists moving around and performing in different locations like Berlin, Prague, or Vienna. Would you see, as a performer and performance practice issues, would you see aesthetically different stage productions because of the reserved nature of those different locations, because they weren't all the same?
It's a really good question. In the case of Paul Almontes, no. Paul could only go to specific places. He was not someone that could just fall into any cabaret and perform. He was a specific color, but he would go to Prague and had a specific place outside in Karlovy that he would perform in. As a matter of fact, that's where he was actually picked up by the Gestapo. So I feel that it depends on their act. Of course, cabaret during this time was very kind of segregated, for lack of a word. You had Jewish cabaret, you had the political cabaret, where like Yura Soifer and the likes, Erica Mann would perform. So rarely did you see entertainment or strictly singing cabaret be isolated in Vienna from the others. So I think it would be particularly tricky to find which stage you were going to perform on, because you couldn't just go from one city with your act and perform on any stage, but each of the cities had stages that you could perform on. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Kind of circumvent. It's really more about the individual stage you would perform on, the actual cabaret or the Kleinkunstbühne, than it was the city that was located in.
Thank you very much, Casey. For Katherine, the question is about Bernstein and his personal preferences and his political stance. As a conductor, did he have the opportunity to boycott, or so let's say boycott, or present his personal stance, political stance as a conductor?
Yeah, it's a good question. And he was an extremely politically involved person. So I would say that is also a little bit like the phenomenon that Casey's describing. It's conditioned by which stage he's on, and by place. So within the US, for sure, he did quite a bit of activism kind of from the podium. And in the context of Vienna, it's more subtle. A lot of the time it's not absent, but it's there in the programming. And if you know him as a person and have read any press that he's done in the US, maybe an interview here or there that he's done, you know sort of what he means by continuing to program a Jewish artist like Mahler, or you know why he's invited somebody like mezzo-soprano Ruby Grist, who's African-American. Like, all of these nods have a context in the United States that can be carried with him and communicated when he's in Austria, but it's much more obvious and it's much more direct within the American context than it is within the Viennese. That said, he was part of an extremely political move, which was he led the Vienna Philharmonic's first tour to Israel. So he still eventually becomes a political figure and a little bit of an ambassadorial role essentially that he's playing. I look at that moment and I think, yeah, he's probably the only person that could have done that as a conductor. There's a reason they asked him to make that journey with them. So for sure, yes, he is. It's abundantly full of opportunities, and there are varying levels of directness and obviousness with which he makes those points. He also famously, his wife hosted a benefit for the Black Panthers in their apartment. It was very much her initiative that he was there, and then had to answer for the fact that he was there. In fact, actually Israeli newspapers, some of them were extremely displeased with this because of the, I will say, the supposed anti-Semitism of the Black Panther platform, and that is supposed. But yeah, he was famous also for sometimes getting himself also into a little bit of trouble. But I think if you look at what he's doing within Austria, he's also capable of being subtle sometimes too. It's not his natural tendency, but he is capable of doing it. Yeah.
I would like to jump in on that. One of my favorite things, and this is strictly from LGBTQI plus research, is that time in November of 1989, when George H.W. Bush was awarding Bernstein the National Medal of the Arts, and he refused it because the National Endowment of the Arts had refused grant funding because there was an AIDS-related art exhibit going on in New York City. So Bernstein just said, absolutely not. You know, he was not a subtle person at times. He could be very much in your face and a newsmaker. But I think, like Katie says, it's a lot easier for him to do that on our soil than it is on others.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you very much to both of you. The last question is about programs. I guess this is for Hermann and also for Kevin, but the question is it limited, the grants that are between Fulbright and Botstiber, are they limited to specific fields of study?
Hermann, do you want to take that?
So the grants are quite broad, actually, for the Austrians and Americans going to the United States and Austria. It shall follow the mission of both of our institutions, promoting mutual understanding between Austria and the United States, as well as bringing Austria and the United States a bit closer together and looking at the history, as well as in future collaborations, so to say. So what's important is you want to establish bridges which unite our two countries and the institutions, like sustainable bridges. That's really important and key to our grants and our combined grants. And with regard to the areas, I mean, it's one of our most open grants with regard to the fields. And it's, at least for the US side, it's, I think, the only grant we have which is open to all institutions in Austria. So it's a very, very wonderful opportunity to come to the Austrian soil, so to say, to the university, to an institution you want to go. The others are linked to specific institutions here in Austria. So that's what I would like to share with you now. And Kevin, do you want to join?
No, it's I agree wholeheartedly. And Fulbright Austria sits at the core of our own mission, which is to further understanding and support for relationships between our country and Austria, including the lands and peoples of the old Austro-Hungarian Empire. And Fulbright Austria does that precisely and exactly, and every year they do it. In our other grant making, we're always looking for scholars who come up with their own projects in line with that mission. But so we're always searching for those people. But Fulbright Austria does it every year, which is nice.
Thank you. Just to bring that also to our grantees and alums here, this question. So Casey and Katherine, is there a reason why you specifically chose our shared award, our co-funded award by BIAAS and Fulbright Austria? Is there a reason why you chose to apply for these awards?
Katie?
Actually, because I was the first awardee and it was a new award at the time, I had actually applied for an American Studies award. So it was not actually intentional, but I'm ever so grateful that they plucked mine out of the pile as one that might fit this new award that had been created. So it was a lucky coincidence, but I will say that what's nice about working with Botstiber, because I have been lucky enough to receive a travel grant for a conference that was sponsored and some other things that I've done with Botstiber, that they pay particular attention to then what happens to your work afterward, that there's kind of a follow through with this organization that I think is really special. And I will say, actually, as an outgoing member of the editorial board of the Journal of Austrian-American History, that there are multiple ways to publish that Botstiber sponsors that are really excellent opportunities. Just to plug that as a place to put your work once you've returned from your grant. So I think that's something that's really special about the organization, even if I initially found it, or rather, I guess they found me. That's what happened.
And I was attracted to it because of its flexibility. It's hard to find something that that spoke to both of my areas, to music and LGBTQI+ society and culture, and my fascination with Austrian legal history as Austro-Hungarian legal history as it relates to laws surrounding those communities. So it was hard to even wrap my head around what grant would you go through, and you go through all of the different grants on the website, and then there's one. It really is incredibly flexible. Its mission is broad enough to be able to encompass all aspects of the research. So for me, there was no question that was the one I was going to apply for. And I have every intention to do a research grant, because the deadline is March 31st, just to plug that as well, to be able to continue my research there.
Thank you for sharing your experience and your thoughts on this topic. So Mitch, further questions? I mean, we are
any further questions.
Okay, so we are also actually over time. So again, Casey and Katherine, thank you for sharing your time with us. And also thank you for this enlightening discussion. I think it was one of our first, actually it was the first alum chat where grant alums interviewed each other. I think that's a wonderful new feature we introduced here, together with the Botstiber Institute of Austrian-American Studies. So thank you BIAAS as well. And thank you, Kevin, for giving us this opportunity to come together and discuss these wonderful projects here. Kevin, any final words from your end?
No, I'm just delighted to have met this from a distance, to have met Katherine and Casey, and it's been my pleasure. Seriously, the psychic reward that I get from this work that I do is to learn about your work, and it's fascinating. It really is. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, thank you. And we learned that there's a long-time relationship, not just with Fulbright Austria, but also with BIAAS, when you have this wonderful award. So with this, I want to thank the entire audience for joining us today, everybody who's joining us on YouTube as well. And I would like to thank everybody in the back end, so to say, who helped us to produce this wonderful alum chat here, the first in 2022, and the first where we had 2 alums interviewing each other. So with this, I would like to inform you about the next alum chat, which is on March 8th. And we will have, again, 2 alums joining us. It's Hannelore Veit and Gregory Parole joining us online as well. And I hope you all join us as well, so that we can continue this discussion about all these wonderful activities which await Fulbrighters and our grantees when they join our program. So until then, bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you all.